Hey everyone, welcome back to our study in the book of Revelation. We have now reached the point where we're going to study the church of Philadelphia, and that's the faithful church. Christ has nothing to say negatively about this church. It's a great church. We call it the remnant church that will be left in the last days, and we'll talk more about that. And so if you have your Bibles, we're going to be studying Revelation chapter 3, 7 through 13, and it's all about the Philadelphia church. Anyway, when you hear the word Philadelphia, I know what comes to your mind: the birthplace of Rocky Balboa, the Italian stallion, or where William Penn founded, Philadelphia here in America, and where the Quakers were free to practice their version of Christianity. But really, William Penn took the name from this place in Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, Philadelphia, and brought it to America and named a very famous city in America, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Anyway, this city, again, in ancient times, was right there in Asia Minor, was right there where Paul had his journeys through Asia Minor, and Philadelphia is one of the seven churches obviously mentioned in the book of Revelation. And so it's modern-day Turkey, basically. So a little history on the background of Philadelphia in Turkey. According to scholars, it was founded about 150 BC by King Attalus of Pergamum. And his nickname, get this, his nickname was Philadelphia. And of course, the meaning of Philadelphia means, we call it brotherly love, but literally it means the lover of a brother. And so this king, Attalus, was noted by a lot of people who was around him, that he had a real love for his brother, Eumenes. And so basically what they saw, that characteristic from him, they said, well, we're just going to name this city after him and call it Philadelphia in honor of him. So that's where the name came from. This name Philadelphia obviously has application to the church that was there in 95 AD, obviously. And it fit well with the condition of that church, that this was a remnant church, that they were meeting all the conditions spiritually that Christ wanted them to meet. They weren't doing crazy things. There wasn't anything Christ can condemn this church for. And anyway, a good term to use for it is brotherly love, because there was no infighting. Like we saw, if you read in 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, of the fighting that went on, in Corinth, this church kept it all together. And so the term brotherly love really has a good meaning to be applied to it. It also is to be applied to the future Philadelphia element. We are right now living in the future Philadelphia element in the Laodicean era. And the Philadelphia element is not only referring to 95 AD, but it is referring to a part of church history that dominated from about AD 1648 to up until this day, okay? And it's the remnant church. And that remnant church will carry on all the way to the very end, to the day of the rapture. And so the Philadelphia church will go through Laodicea. And so that's what we're seeing right now. We're seeing a great separation happening in the church between Laodicea and Philadelphia. And you would include the Smyrna element too, because there's a suffering church as well. And the suffering church, Smyrna, and the Philadelphia church have no condemnations from the Lord. They're doing great. Just keep doing what you're doing. Obviously, the other churches like Sardis and Laodicea, Thyatira, Pergamum, Ephesus, they all have their condemnations from the Lord, and it's something they need to overcome, right? So this is where we're at right now prophetically. Around the world, there's a remnant Philadelphia element and a Smyrna element, okay? And it's in the midst of this crazy Laodicean apostate church. And so the great separation is happening. So anyway, that's what's currently going on. But anyway, let's start in to understand this text. And remember, when we're studying the churches, there's three ways to understand the churches, because just going from verse to verse to verse, it will apply to these different situations. Okay, so in your interpretation, you have to know who it's talking to in the interpretation. In some situations, it's talking to unbelievers, okay, that claim to be Christian. In other situations, it's talking to unfaithful believers. And then in other situations, it's talking to faithful believers. So you have to know that. And then you also have to know that there are elements in the text that apply to the current situation in 95 AD, that apply obviously to all remnant churches of all the church age, and then also to the church era that was dominated by Philadelphia. Okay? And really, the end of Philadelphia, even though it continues on, the real strength of Philadelphia ended around the 1900s, okay? And it was in the early 1900s that apostasy and Laodicea really took root in the last century. So Philadelphia is still with us, but its main influence, you could say, is 1700 to 1900, okay? About 200 years. So anyway, I know that's a lot to think about, but you have to understand those items when you interpret the book of Revelation, or specifically the churches, because each passage might refer to someone or something else, an era or a historical situation or just a characteristic or whatnot. So think about those things when you read. Anyway, let's go through it. It says, to the angel of the church in Philadelphia. And obviously, we just to remind ourselves, there's always an angel assigned to each church. And they are a watcher angel, a good watcher angel. And they're to protect the church, observe the church, and keep records of what goes on in the church and what is said. To be a witness against that church in the day of judgment, at the bema seat of Christ. So each church has these angels assigned to them. And so this is given to the Philadelphia angel. And again, it's not a pastor, it's not a messenger, it is an angel, because angels play a prominent role in the book of Revelation, and they serve as witnesses. So anyway, again, Philadelphia is a very faithful church. You'll notice that in the text. Philadelphia takes the Bible for what it says, literally, and then they live it out, okay? They're faithful in their discipleship. They're faithful in their evangelism. They're faithful to serve. And this faithfulness is not affected by anything going on in their city, anything in their culture, or like right now, anything going on in the world of apostasy. The pressure from the outside and the inside they can face, and they stay faithful. They don't buckle under peer pressure. They don't shrink back when persecution's too hard. They just keep moving forward faithfully. And for them, it's just a matter of just doing what the Lord tells them to do, being faithful and obedient to Him. And it's kind of like, when you go to the gym, most people can't stand going to the gym, but they like the results of it. So what do? When they go to the gym, they just bury their head and just get it done. And they just do it. And that's kind of how Philadelphia is, man. They're like a bull, man. They just bury their head in, they trust God and obey, and they just push through everything. And that's a good marker of when you see the Philadelphia element even to today. Those kinds of people in the Philadelphia element, they're strong in the Lord. You can't back them down. They're in the trenches. They're on the tip of the spear. They speak the truth in love. They won't commit the sin of silence. They will buck the world system. They will go against what the government tells them to do when it's a lie. Okay, they spiritually fight, and that Philadelphia element, man, it's really what keeps the church on point is that Philadelphia element, because Laodicea doesn't help at all. Laodicea is causing more problems. But man, Philadelphia keeps everything in line theologically. They don't apostatize, and they're just great. So you want to make sure you're part of a Philadelphia church. You want to make sure you're a Philadelphia believer, a remnant believer, right? So when we get into verse 7 and 8, Jesus is now going to be described as our vindicator. Okay, he's going to vindicate us from the naysayers, from this world, from the enemies, okay? And he's also the one who possesses authority over Philadelphia church ministry opportunities and even personally our ministry opportunities. He's the one who gives us these ministry opportunities, okay? And so you're going to see a description of himself, but unlike the other churches where he describes himself from the vision of Revelation 1, where it was that John saw a vision of Jesus coming in judgment. This description of Christ is not taken from that vision, because all those descriptions of Christ in Revelation 1 are descriptions of judgment. Well, there's no aspect of judgment to this church. And so it's going to emphasize another aspect of the Messiah from different parts of the Bible. And so it says this in 7b, right, these things say he who is holy and he who is true. Now, the background on this is we obviously know Christ is holy. We know God is holy. He's entirely different than you and I. We possess the sin nature. God is pure, right? He's different. So historians note several interesting things about Philadelphia at the time that this was written. Well, at the time this was written, Philadelphia was a temple warden. And being a temple warden, they would give the Roman emperor the title, the Son of the Holy One. Okay? So you can see why Christ would say this, because they're living in a city that calls the emperor the Son of the Holy One, and Christ is saying, that's not true. I'm the Holy One. I'm the one that's true. Not this emperor that's going on in your town. And so it's a contrast to what was historically happening there. Furthermore, when Messiah states that he is holy in contrast to the emperor who's not holy, when Messiah states that, he is asserting his deity, right? That he is God, the second person of the Trinity, right? And that's what holy means, that only God is holy. And that's why you have the thrice holy stated by the angels, holy, 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 referring to the Trinitarian persons in the Godhead. The Father is holy, the Son is holy, the Holy Spirit is holy. Holy, holy, holy. And so it's a assertion of deity, right? And the fact that God's character is without flaw, he's morally pure, and therefore they can rely on him and trust him in these situations that they're in. And then Messiah goes on to call himself he who is true. And the idea is that Messiah is the real genuine God. He's the real genuine Messiah. Okay, there are no other gods other than him, right? And of course, that stands in stark contrast to what was going on in Philadelphia and all through, the Mediterranean area, where they worship all kinds of gods, right? And all those false gods claim to be true, but Messiah says, no, I am true. And so when you bring this into modern day application for you and I, we have all kinds of other gods still out there that people are portraying as holy and true. And the funny thing is, a lot of times what they do is they use Jesus' name and they pour a different meaning and a different morality into that Jesus. And then they attack us, right? Saying we're not the real Christians, but they are the real Christians following the real Jesus. But the Jesus they serve is false. It's not the authentic one. It's not the true one from the Bible. It's one they made up. It's one that allows them to sin in their own lives, right? And that's going to be very important because Jesus is going to make a reference to this in our vindication. And so we worship the holy and true God. Many people out there in the world don't. We know the cults, we know the false religions, and we even know those who claim to be Christians who follow a different Jesus. They say they follow the Bible, but they don't. They call themselves the people of God, but they're not. Because their Jesus, their Trinity, allows them to participate in sin. That kind of idea, right? And so they call us who rail against sin, who speak out against sin, the haters, the bigots, the racists, the homophobes, the Islamophobes, all that stuff, right? So that's why he's saying these things, to tell them, no, you guys are right. The Philadelphia church is right. You're worshiping the one true God, the one holy true God. And that's important for our vindication. And then he says that he who has the key of David. Now, this is interesting. Keys are very important. Keys in the Bible represent authority. Remember where Christ gave Peter and the apostles the keys of the kingdom, and that had to do with not just simply church discipline, but with Peter, it had to do with opening the door of the gospel to different people groups in the book of Acts. So Peter opened the door to the Jews at Pentecost, then he opened the door at Samaria after he heard that a revival had happened from Philip, and then he goes over there and verifies it, and then he goes to Cornelius' house and verifies that salvation has come to the Gentiles. And so basically Peter was given the keys of the kingdom to authenticate that the gospel had reached all the ends of the earth. Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, and last being Cornelius. So after Cornelius is saved, Peter does not have to go and authenticate the different people groups with the keys. But the keys still remain in the church as church discipline. Now, that's why Peter exercised church discipline on Ananias and Sapphira. Okay, he had that ability. Now today in the church, the keys of the kingdom, basically in our church discipline, it has to do with following Matthew 18, basically, and following the 3 steps laid out in Matthew 18. We can't do what the apostles did. We can't do what the prophets did, because when they church disciplined somebody, as you can see with Ananias and Sapphira, it was more severe, right? Our church discipline today is excommunication. So anyway, that's the idea, but it was authority. So the apostles had authority, and now the church has authority for church discipline, okay? So we get an idea. So this is a key, and it's authority, but it's the key of David, okay? The key of David is different than the keys of the kingdom, okay? And what it refers to is authority, basically, and a claim of the Messiah of David's house. David's royal house is the idea, the key of David, right? So David, had a political throne, and the prediction in the Davidic covenant was that one day there will be a man that rules on David's throne for all eternity. And that implies a God-man, right? He has to be human, but he has to be able to sit on the throne forever. And that implies that the Messiah will be the God-man, that the Messiah is going to be from the lineage of David, right? As a human being, but then as God can sit on David's throne forever. So David's throne is a political throne in Jerusalem, okay? It's not the Father's throne, it's a political throne in Jerusalem to rule the Messianic kingdom. And so that's where that's referring to, but it's broader than Jesus just ruling over Jerusalem and Israel in the Messianic kingdom. When Jesus rules and reigns in the Messianic kingdom, he also has authority that he reigns over heaven and earth. All authority has been given to him, right? So it goes beyond just Israel. it's heaven and earth, the whole cosmos, basically, okay? And so it's Jewish in nature, but I want to say global, it's universal in its aspect, in its scope. And so all authority has been given to him. So he has that authority, right? And he will take that authority and rule and reign after the second coming, right? Jesus right now rules in our hearts. Jesus is also, sovereign, which means he has the right to rule, right? But that's what we pray about. Remember in the Lord's Prayer, it says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so our prayer is that when Jesus comes back, his will be done on earth. Because right now it's not being done on earth because you have so many people sinning and going against the Lord, right? But one day he will stop all of that. And so that's where the keys of David refer to, okay? Furthermore, there's another little aspect I want to bring to your attention about these keys, and it's very important. So it says in the following passage that he who opens and no one shuts, and shuts no one opens. And so that key is related to opening and shutting something, okay? And then if he opens it, you can't shut it, humanly speaking, or angelically speaking, or fallen angels, or Satan, or demons, okay? No one can close what he opens, and no one can open what he shuts, is the idea. Okay, so that's associated with the key of David. What is that? That goes back to the days of Hezekiah. So let's do some background to understand this passage, okay? So during the days of Hezekiah, Assyria was invading Israel, okay? And what happened was a lot of the Jewish leaders were trusting in Egypt to deliver them instead of God. And that was their foreign policy. And, Isaiah is trying to tell them, don't do that. Don't go with Egypt. You don't need Egypt. Just trust God. He will deliver you. But they wouldn't. So the foreign policy that happened with the ruling leaders was to do a deal with Egypt. Anyway, there was a chief of staff type of guy who was in charge of the palace and the royal treasury, okay? And his name was Shebna, okay? This is interesting about Shebna. He is the only one Isaiah prophesies specifically about. Usually Isaiah will prophesy about nations and kingdoms and stuff like that. But then Isaiah goes specific after this guy and prophesies about Shebna. Well, anyway, Shebna was running a scam, basically. He was involved in this foreign policy to rely on Egypt, and he was dishonest. He was basically, trying to gain power like a politician, right? Gain position to enrich himself, and as it was, he guarded the treasure. Okay, so he had access to the money, the war chest, and all that stuff. So anyway, he had a key, and that because of his authority, he had a key to the vault of Israel, okay? And he could access those riches, okay? And so pretty scary for a politician to have access to a lot of money, right? And anyway, he's doing this, right? He's scamming Israel at the time. Well, anyway, God nails him for it, and God sends Isaiah to talk about him and prophesy about him, and it says that, look, I'm going to take you and sling you and hurl you into basically a far country, which is Babylon, and he will. And he was sent to Babylon. And anyway, what happened after God got him out of that situation and got rid of him, God brought in a godly man by the name of Eliakim. Eliakim, okay? And you can read about Eliakim in Isaiah 22, 20 through 23. In fact, we're going to read it right now, okay? Now, notice what it says about this man, Eliakim, who replaced Shebna. Verse 20 in Isaiah 22. Then it shall be in that day that I will call my servant Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah. I will clothe him with your robe and strengthen him with your belt. I will commit your responsibility into his hand. He shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. Note this in verse 22. The key of the house of David I will lay on his shoulder. Did you catch that? So he shall open and no one shall shut, and he shall shut and no one shall open. You catch that? Okay, that's the same thing Christ said, right? I will fasten him as a peg in a secure place, and he will become a glorious throne to his father's house. So what's going on here? Okay, so Eliakim's a good guy, but what Eliakim pictures is he's a typology for the coming Messiah, for Christ, okay? And like Eliakim was given authority, a key to the house of David, right? That pictures that authority will be given one day to the Messiah, right? That authority. And the reason why he gave this authority to Eliakim, because, man, the guy was trustworthy. You could depend on him. He was obedient to God. He was a good man. Well, it pictures why all authority is given to Christ, because Christ is sinless. The Messiah is sinless, and he made the sacrifice. And so therefore, because of that, he is given authority overall, because he is trustworthy and dependable and obedient. And so Christ alone now has this authority, and we talked about having, authority over heaven and earth, but he's also has authority over the Father's storehouse of riches. Okay, remember Eliakim getting this authority and key, and remember Shebnab had access to the vaults of Israel, had access to money. Okay, so Christ has access to the storehouses of heaven, to the blessings of heaven, right? The riches of heaven. And because of that, Messiah has access to all the spiritual treasures of the Father, which then he can bestow on his believers, his followers, those who are obedient and faithful. Okay, so you're following with that? Okay. So basically, if you go back into the text you're reading and realize that passage in Isaiah, then Messiah is now applying it to himself as the God-man, a ruler of heaven and earth and David's kingdom. And then he states, I am the one who shuts and no one can open it, and opens and no one can shut. What he is saying is that Messiah's will cannot be stopped. It cannot be opposed. Satan can't stop him. Demons can't stop him. Humans can't stop him. Because he is God, no one can stop his will. And the idea is that Messiah then governs all the events of history on earth, like the Father does, right? And with this authority that's been given to the Messiah, in history, he opens doors and he closes doors. And what he shuts, no one can open, right? No human power, no fallen angel or demonic or satanic power can stop what he determines. So now, that's a universal principle, okay? That nothing can stop the will of Jesus. Okay. Then he applies that to the Philadelphia church. And he says this in verse 8. I know your works. So the idea is referring to Jesus' omniscience, okay? I know what you guys are doing, and they're doing great because, man, they have no complaints, right, from the Messiah. They're doing great. You guys are knocking it out. Keep up the good job. Keep up the good work. Great, man. And so then, because of that faithfulness of the Philadelphia remnant, he's going to give them an opportunity, a ministry opportunity. And he says this, see, I have set before you. And the idea I've set before you is I am placing this at your doorstep, so to speak, and I'm going to give it to you. I'm going to grant this to you. I'm going to supply it. I'm going to deliver. I'm going to commit it, to entrust. That's what the Greek word means. It's a stewardship issue. I'm going to give you this, and you're going to be a good steward of this. And I'm going to entrust you to this to do some type of ministry. Okay? That's what he's placing before the Philadelphia believers there and all Philadelphia believers, because to whom is faithful in little, they will be given much, right? And that's what they have proven. So therefore, he can expand their ministry and give them more opportunities, okay? And that's what he's going to do. He's going to open the doors of ministry for the Philadelphia church, which would make sense. He's not going to expand the doors of ministry and open the doors of ministry for Laodicea or Sardis. Those guys can't get their act straight. He's going to open the door for Philadelphia because they're faithful and obedient. And so that's what the idea. Now, here's the thing. The same goes personally to the Philadelphia remnant believer. It not only goes to the church, but it goes to the Philadelphia remnant believer. If you're a Philadelphia remnant believer, what God wants to do, because you're faithful in a few things, I will put you in charge of many things. He wants to expand your ministry. So what you should be thinking about is, how is the Lord expanding my ministry? What does he want me to do? He wants to broaden you out. You might like the ministry you're doing right now, and it's great, and it's sweet, and you love it. But God's saying, hey, I got this new thing over here, and it's actually going to expand your ministry. And that's kind of, how you're to see this. And I'll say this on a personal level. 4 or 5 years ago, the Lord had led me to do online ministry. And, it was hard. I didn't want to do it. And it was a lot of work. And I was just like, I don't know. I can't see anything coming from this. But anyway, he kept pushing me and saying, do it, Brandon, do it, Brandon, do it. I'm going to expand you. I'm going to expand the ministry of your church. So we did it. And lo and behold, you know what happened? We started the ministry. It took like 2 years to get up and going because of just the equipment, and it was difficult. Start going, and then you know what happened? Is the Charlie Oscar Victor Igloo Delta 19er came up, and they shut down the world. And you know what happened? We were rolling with our online ministry, and we blew out of the waters how much we could reach people. I mean, just thousands upon thousands all over the world were able to hear us, especially when they couldn't go to church. And so it proved to us that God expanded our ministry so we could do this online ministry and reach people around the world. So that's a classic example of God granting you, a church, an opportunity to say, I'm going to give you an opportunity to do this because you've been faithful. I'm going to open the door up even wider for you. And the same is true for you personally. God wants to expand your ministry if you are faithful. But the key is you have to be faithful. You can't be messing around. You can't be, in sin and goofed up, not walking with the Lord. You got to be on target with him. You got to be walking with him in faithfulness and obedience. And he wants to expand your ministry. That's the idea. The concept then is, if Messiah lays a ministry opportunity in front of you, no one can stop you from doing that. Because he opens the door and he says no one can shut it. If he opens the door for you and you take it, no one's shutting that door. You can go through. But the same is true is if he closes the door on you, or some type of ministry he doesn't want you to do, you can butt your head against that wall. It's like a brick wall, but you're never going to go through it because he's closed the opportunity for you. And so that's how you have to understand the will of God in doing ministry and even in your life in general. He shuts doors and he opens them. And our idea is to follow the open door. And so that's how you gauge ministry. So he shut the door many, many times on us in ministry, and basically he's saying, okay, that methodology doesn't work anymore. That's not working. Well, take for instance, like the churches back in the 60s and 70s, and they used to do a bus ministry. Well, that doesn't work in our modern day and time. We've got too many, child predators and stuff like that. It's too much of a risk. So that ministry doesn't work anymore. So the door's closed on that. It was open for a period of time, but it is closed. And I know some churches still kind of do it, but it's kind of gone away. But I'll tell you what the new open door is. The new open door is to use technology and use video for going on the internet. That's the open door. And I'm telling you, man, if churches don't see this, they don't use it, they're missing out on the biggest door Christ has ever opened for the church. It is massive. It's a worldwide reach, and yet very few churches are even doing anything about it. I don't get it. But that's the new thing right now, that the door that he has opened. And I hope people take advantage of it. Now, this is interesting about the Philadelphia church, and this is what historians say was happening in Philadelphia, and I think this is pretty cool. They note that Philadelphia at the time was this kind of geographical gateway to the east and the west, okay? And basically Philadelphia, they say, was situated on like these crossroads, and you had all kinds of languages coming through and all kinds of cultures coming through. And so when they looked at this from a historical standpoint, what they found was that Philadelphia seemed to be right in the middle of all this, and it had a special purpose with a special intention, because it was situated, they say, on the borders of Mysia, Lydia, and Phrygia. And these are different regions in Asia Minor, or Turkey as we call it today. So historians say that it was founded there with the deliberate intention that Philadelphia would kind of be a missionary town for the Greek culture and the Greek language to Asia Minor. Whether that was Phrygia or Lydia, they were using Philadelphia to kind of be an evangelize for Greek way of life and Greek language, okay? That's what the original intention was. It was a missionary town, not so much for God, but for Greek. Now that the church is there, it's going to be used as a missionary endeavor too, not to extend Greek or Greek life, but to extend the gospel, right? And so its origins are missionary in that nature. And so instead of spreading Greek, Philadelphia will become a great missionary church. It evangelizes. It sends people all over. And the fact that Philadelphia stood at the crossways between east and west, it could send the gospel out both ways, right? And again, that was the perfect situation for them, and how God wanted to use them to get the gospel all over the Mediterranean. So now then, let's bring it to another application. The other application is the era of Philadelphia, which I said was around 1700 to 1900, okay? This was a major missionary movement that was happening in those 200 years. Major missionary. In fact, the gospel was spread all over the entire globe almost. So anyway, it started, according to historians, with the Moravian Brethren in Germany. And basically what they did, they started to meet in small groups for prayer, and basically they felt led to be missionaries all over the world and go out and spread the gospel. Well, again, things came from all of this. There was the Great Awakening, and that first Great Awakening was an evangelical movement, and it revitalized a lot of Christianity. It swept through Europe, obviously Britain, America, and in America it was hitting the colonies, and this was like in the early 1730s and 1740s. And basically it left a permanent impact on what is today American Protestantism. Now we know we're in Laodicea, but there's remnants of this Great Awakening that hit America still with us today. And again, this movement began in England, and we call it the Puritan movement, basically. And I'm not saying everything the Puritans taught was right. I disagree with the Puritans about their 5-point Calvinism. but they had a heart for evangelism. The Puritans were able to read the Bible literally and see that Israel and the church were different and separate, that God still had a plan for Israel, and that one day Israel would be brought back into the land, and they become the faith in the Messiah. And this is where basically dispensationalism was rediscovered. The Catholic Church had buried it from the early church fathers, and then when Origen and Augustine came, they buried the literal interpretation of prophecy. And then once it escaped the denominationalism of Luther and Calvin, and it escaped the Catholic Church, people started reading the Bible literally. And that was part of the Puritan movement. They started taking the Bible literally, as they should have, as the early Christians did, and as you and I do, right? And because of that, great things emerged. They rediscovered, and that's the term, rediscovered, really biblical eschatology. And so there was a lot of great things that came out of this movement of the First Great Awakening. And you might know people like John Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, right? John Newton, Amazing Grace, right? This awakening affected all the Wesleyan revivals that happened, right? You remember George Whitefield preaching in England and America, right? And in America, you had Jonathan Edwards as one of its leaders. And then later on, in the early 1800s, the Second Great Awakening started happening, and that was basically through the Baptists and the Methodists. And remember the Methodist circuit riders who rode on horseback, expanding the gospel westward. You had camp revivals. And this was a major time of sharing the gospel, right? Again, this is the Philadelphia element. And then when you looked with missionary movements, missionaries went crazy. It was a time of great revival of missionary interest. So we had people like William Carey in England, going to India and preach the gospel. You got Robert Moffat and his famous son-in-law, David Livingstone, who went to Africa and did a bunch of work there in missionary endeavors. In American missionary work, you had Adoniram Judson, went out to Burma and did a lot of missionary work out there. You had Hudson Taylor, who went to China, remember that? And you had great evangelists, right? Whitefield, Wesley, Spurgeon, who were all great evangelists. Now, I disagree with their Calvinism of Whitefield and Spurgeon, but man, they were great evangelists, and you can't deny that. And this went through the late 1800s, and then you had Charles Finney, you had D.L. Moody, all those things, right, of evangelism and mission work. And that's what we see with that Philadelphia element. Now today, that remnant still exists, and that remnant is always about evangelism, always about missions, always about discipleship. You will always find those elements in that remnant church. Whereas you look at some of these other churches, they do not do missions. They do not share the gospel. They'll do the social gospel, but they won't do the real gospel. And that's why all these churches are getting involved in the social justice warrior stuff. That's not the gospel. That's not the gospel. The true gospel is the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah. And they're not preaching that anymore. But when you're with a Philadelphia person or you're a Philadelphia church, man, they're hot on missions. They're hot sharing the gospel. They're hot on discipleship. They're on fire, man. And you can't quench it. Whereas you go to Sardis, they're dead. Laodicea is worldly, checked out. And so that's what the hallmark is of Philadelphia. So anyway, we're going to stop there. Well, next time we're going to continue with it in this. This is a great church. You want to make sure you're part of a Philadelphia church because, they get rewarded. They get vindicated. There's a lot of good stuff going on in this Philadelphia element. So we'll continue part 2 next time. We're going to look at the vindication. He's going to talk about how they have little strength, but yet they're rich. And so we'll talk about all those kinds of things next time, all right? All right, keep studying, and learning the scriptures, because the more you know them, the better prepared for the world that we're in you will be, the more mature you will be to be able to cope and take what's going on in this world. And so keep studying and you draw closer to the Lord, all right? We'll see you next time. God bless you.